Good morning, boys and girls. I see you've joined me again. Trust you've had a fun 2 weeks of playing Candy Crush, watching YouTube videos till 3 in the morning, just doing whatever the heck you want. Well, I'm afraid that's over. Time to get back to some economics. I was going to start out today's lecture with a little chat about something called gross domestic product. Hitherto, all of our economics knowledge and pursuit of economics has been on something called microeconomics. Microeconomics is good for discussing the actions of individuals, workers, consumers, things like that. But it is kind of limited. It doesn't really have a language for some of the bigger things that happen in the economy, such as growth, inflation, unemployment, trade deficits, and things like that. So, things that seem like perfectly rational behavior in a microeconomics world might not be quite so rational or sensible in a macroeconomics world. Let me give you a few vignettes as an example. Let's just say you're at a rock concert or rap or country or whatever your favorite music genre is, but you're at this concert, it's really cool, you're having a great time. And you stand up because you want to see better. Seems to make sense to me. We've all been there. But everyone else stands up too because they want to see better. They made an individual decision. So in the end, are you really seeing anything better? No, because everyone's standing now. So that can happen in a macroeconomic sort of world too. Consider a farmer with crops. The farmer wants to make more money, so the farmer plants more crops. But what if all the other farmers do the same thing? The supply would increase greatly. The price wouldn't go up. And in the end, the farmer would have done a whole lot more work and not really gotten much out of it. So that's what macroeconomics is really here to explain to us. Let me get a close-up of that real quick. That is a solid working definition of macroeconomics right there. The aggregated top-down view of the economy focused on such issues as unemployment, inflation, economic growth, and balance of trade. Thank you. So, well, there's two ways of really looking at something called GDP. GDP is what we're going to mostly focus on today. GDP is the jumping off point for economics here. Gross domestic product is the standard measure for the size of a nation's economy in a year. So it's sort of like a scorecard for your economy and your country. Do you have a large GDP? Do you have a small GDP? It's kind of like a thing that's like a contest, I guess, in some cases. Well, there's two ways to really measure it. You can measure it from sort of the supply side, what's produced, which would be with durable goods, non-durable goods, services, and structures. So these are the criteria for GDP by what is produced. The year we're using here, and the figures are from 2004. So for 2004, the U.S. economy in total per GDP was $11.7 trillion. Durable goods were $1.7 trillion. Durable goods would be things like refrigerators, cars, things of that nature. Non-durable goods, $2.1 trillion for 17.9% share of GDP. Those are things that are, candy bars, things like that. Services, so you can see services is quite large there at 6.7 trillion. It was over 50% of the economy, 57%. So people say that is a service economy. That would be things like waitering, bartending, teaching, lawn service stuff. That's all services. And of course, structures are buildings and things of that nature. So that's the way of measuring GDP per what is produced. The other way you can do it is this way, by what is demanded. Again, we're using the year of 2004. Here's the formula for it. C plus I plus G plus X minus M, which I'll explain below. But consumption is, just people going out and buying different items. We do it all the time. Investment is investing your money in some kind of, investment vehicle like stocks or whatever. Government expenditures, 2.2 trillion, which seems a little low, but when you have things like, say, welfare or Social Security or something like that, that shows up in consumption. So that actually doesn't really get counted as government spending necessarily, but we all know it is, and it comes out of our tax dollars and things like that. Below that we have exports. Exports are things that we send out of the country and we sell to other countries in a trade type of scenario. That was 1.2 trillion. And then you've got imports below, which are things that we bring in. So if you look at your Nike shoes or your sweatshirt or something, it might say made in China, made in Bangladesh, something like that. And those are imports. So you can see imports is the only negative here, because we're importing those in and paying other people for making those things. That's got the minus sign, and that's why it's subtracted out of GDP. But in either case, it's got to add up to the same amount, the dollar amount of what's consumed or produced in that year. Also, I wanted to note that all this stuff is measured and quantified by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. They've got a web page, they're a government type of function. And also, it changes sometimes. Sometimes the economic estimate for the country might change. They might go back and revise it. Next, I wanted to go to something called per capita GDP. All right, per capita GDP would just be formulated as such. So it's your GDP divided by your population. So if you take a very small country, like for instance, Denmark is a very small country in Europe. They've got not that many people, maybe a little less than 6 million or so. But their GDP is fairly good, and their GDP per capita comes to about $49,000 a year. That's not bad. If we look at a couple other countries, put the USA in there as well. Here's what you've got. China, people talk about China a lot. It's a huge country. Of course, it's got a huge economy as well. When your population is huge, it does kind of help bulk up your economy a little bit. But their per capita GDP is not really that great. This is for, I believe, 2017. Their per capita GDP is about $16,700 a year. Compare that with the US, we have a much smaller population, but we have a big economy. So for us, in 2017, our per capita GDP was about $59,000 or so per person. Then of course I included Denmark there, and this is all stuff that I sourced from CIA World Fact Book, which is a nice little condensed source of notes. And there's different ways of really looking at GDP too. There's real versus nominal, butchered that. But what makes things real for economists is when they're adjusted for inflation. So inflation we'll get into later, but in detail later, but it's essentially, more money in the economy and it makes prices go up. But real numbers means that they're adjusted for inflation. Nominal means that they're just expressed in current US dollars at the time. So if you look at different decades, it might seem like there's really great growth, like the 1970s, for instance. There was a lot of growth in GDP. Was it good? Well, not particularly. Those weren't necessarily great times for the economy. There was a lot of inflation, so a lot of it gets washed away by inflation. GDP is a really good way for comparing different countries' per capita GDP as well. It's not the only thing necessarily in the entire world for comparing countries, but it does help. Also compares different times. Here's a little snapshot of per capita GDP growth for the United States over the last maybe century or so. So you see here's the Great Depression, which is a massive dip in GDP. But generally it rises. It's got a pretty solid rising trend line. And you can find different hiccups in here where you can tell historically there's some kind of problem or something. So 1907 there was a crash. 1929 there was a crash. Here's World War II. All that productivity from World War II kind of bulked up GDP numbers. We were producing stuff and also giving it to other countries. But right after World War II, there's a dip, and then you've got the 50s and 60s. Mostly it rose, and you've got some other dips in here. 70s. This could be one of these. Is probably the 1987 market crash. Here's 2009, more recently, which you guys, I don't know, would have been probably little kids for, and you don't remember that real well. But your parents would. They would remember 2009 real well. But historically, you can track things. Now, if you want to go for per capita GDP and make your per capita GDP really awesome in your country, then that's a pretty good way to go. But just be advised that there are some things that you also have to take into consideration. GDP only measures the final product that comes out. So in terms of an automobile is, it's got the glass windshield, the frame and the body, the rubber tires, whatever electronics are in there. All that stuff as components isn't counted in GDP. So for instance, the glass windshield is not counted in GDP. Only the car is counted in GDP because it's a final product. So that's something to take note of. Also, it doesn't take into account certain other things, which is changes in ownership. If you sell me your car, that doesn't show up in GDP. Leisure time doesn't show up in GDP. I like to have leisure time. You like to have leisure time. But if you have a little or a lot or whatever, it doesn't matter. It doesn't show up in GDP. The environment doesn't show up in GDP. So maybe you're being really productive in your country, but you're laying waste to the forests and polluting the rivers and all that kind of stuff. That's not good, and it does not show up in GDP. Your health doesn't show up in GDP. So are your people healthy, or are they working themselves to death in factories? Well, GDP doesn't reflect that. It doesn't reflect value judgments. Did you buy some silly magazine? I would say Mad Magazine. They just went out of business the other year, but it was a kind of goofy, like trashy magazine with a comic book sort of thing. Or did you get a National Geographic? Either way, the money is counted, but not really the value of the product that's there. Crime's not accounted in GDP. If someone is a vandal and they pick up a rock and throw it through another person's window, well, the man coming to replace the window and the money you pay that person would be reflected in GDP, but it would look better, but of course it wasn't better because it was crime. Well, boys and girls, I think that's going to conclude our lecture for today. I hope it was very stimulating for you. Make sure you guys read some books and try and get some exercise, stretching, whatever. Be productive with your lives, and Marple's here for you. Mr. Powell. Bye-bye.